So, thank you. I'm here with Professor John Rury, Professor of Education and History at University of Kansas, and a prolific author, many articles and books, most recently the 4th edition of Education and Social Change. Yes, Contours in the History of American Schooling. It's tremendous to have you here.
Great pleasure.
Long time noted historian. So we're talking a bit about this effort to try to convey some of the lessons, if you've not lessons, but some of what we can learn from having taken a historical perspective over years and looking at this. And what are some kinds of sort of headline lessons or things that you take after having spent some time in trying to look at the enterprise of schooling from a historical perspective?
Well, schools were established for purposes in the 19th century, and the school system that we have today sort of took shape then, and it's been operating to serve civic purposes and socialization purposes and cognitive purposes, if you will, helping people to think about things a little more clearly. And there's been all kinds of other reforms within that to try to, within that framework, to try to get the schools to do one thing or another. And so what I thought we could talk about today a little bit is what we could call unintended consequences or unexpected outcomes. And a lot of this has to do with the school system has a logic itself. I mean, and this is sort of the neo-institutionalist perspective that we get from sociology, but we can see it certainly historically also, that once the institutions are established, then there's they operate in ways that are some, and this of course is David Tyack, Larry Cuban's point, that resist reforms or transform them. And so I thought we could talk about some of those examples that sort of come up in my own work, and I think sort of and can help us think about schools and what they do and what the possibilities are for them as we consider how we want the education system to look in the future.
You mentioned the Cuban tech, and I love that the wording around this grammar of school and the sort of underlying structures and logics. But we've talked about some unintended consequences of reforms that did go into play.
Yeah, so see, for me, I think that, I mean, there's the institutional logic, certainly, but then there's also the people that the schools serve. And they have a big impact also. So one example we talked about a little while ago was, and this is in my first book, which Education Women's Work, which looked at education for young women, high school education, between roughly 1870 and 1930, so sort of latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century. And so one of the big developments and reform was home economics. And this is a period of large-scale immigration, industrialization, urbanization. And one of the dynamics, or one of the ideas behind school reform at that time was to try to ameliorate or buffer the effects of those big social changes. And reformers were concerned about the youth, the kids who are living in these very crowded city neighborhoods that, and their parents are working in factories or they're working at other menial jobs or living in tenements. And the reformers see these places as unsanitary and unsafe, and that they worry that the kids are not learning the proper way of life that they associate with the United States, you know, sort of the pastoral idea, you know, being in touch with nature and learning the ways of behavior and comportment that they associate with that kind of a setting. So one of the responses was home economics, right? To teach young women how to cook, how to take care of a house, how to have the proper standards of cleanliness, and see, there's a moral dimension to this also, right? Because cleanliness is goodness, right? And also the idea of beauty, right? That make the home beautiful, even within modest means, cleanliness and some aesthetic sensibility about a nice house or a nice apartment. There's a story that appeared in one of these sort of reform publications about the girl who, in her home economics class, learns how to arrange things in the house and tidy things and to remove the garbage and the dirt, and and from a vendor buy a rose and bring it up and put it in a little vase on the windowsill. And then the father who's gotten off from his job, and he's gone to the saloon, and he's had some alcohol, and he's coming home in a stupor, and he comes into this home that's been transformed, and it's cleanly, it's clean, it's neat, and there's this aesthetic dimension with it, and he realizes the error of his ways, and that he feels ashamed for having spent the family money and spent time in the saloon. And see, this idea that the home economics and that the transformation, the consequential transformation of the home, can have this beneficial moral impact on the immigrant family and the culture, and so on. So there's this idea of home economics playing this kind of a larger reform role. Now, okay, so this results in, this and a lot of, sort of similar arguments helps to persuade school authorities in many places that home economics is indeed a good. And of course, the other worry is that these young women, particularly in the cities, they're dropping out of school because their families are struggling. They're in these poor circumstances, and they're going into the labor force. They're working in the garment industry. They're working as domestic servants. They're working in other kinds of light, manufacturing. Which these are jobs that don't require education for the most part. So they worry that. And so the other thing is that this home economics is going to. They're worried that these young women are going to grow up unprepared. They're out of the home. They're not learning from their mothers. They're not going to know how to raise their own families. They may not get married. They're worried about this women losing touch with their domestic roles, their natural domestic roles. So this is the other impulse behind economics, is to train them to be good mothers and good housekeepers. When it doesn't appear to be happening. Okay, so home economics is really developed out of concern for this particular group of potential students. So, now of course, what happens is the home economics goes into the schools, and many other things are going on in the schools at this time. And as it turns out, home economics does not. Many young women take the home economics courses because they're there and they're told to take them, but they're not very popular among the women in the urban context, the young women. Instead, they are going and taking the courses in typing and in stenography and in bookkeeping, because that's another booming market for those kind of jobs. And these young women those are well-paying jobs. Those are jobs in nice, clean offices, not in dirty, dangerous factories, right? The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire occurs at this period, this really terrible accident, hundreds of young women are killed, and it's a big national scandal. So the office is a very safe and appealing environment. There's also lots of eligible young men working in offices. So there's this, and there's these romance novels about the office romances. So there's an allure, right? So in the urban context, these are the courses that are getting the, and not so much home economics. Now, home economics, it turns out, is very appealing to women, young women in rural areas, right? Because they are sort of growing up in this ethos of homemaking and cooking and canning and preserving and all of these sort of domestic dimensions of life in the countryside. So home economics turns out to be very popular in rural areas, small towns, but less so in the cities. So here's an example of a reform that started off with a very clear set of objectives and hopes for social transformation, but that gets transformed itself, not by the school so much, but by the clientele, who had very different interests.
So a legitimate set of worries, or at least legitimate in the minds of those who are having these worries, and a need for some kind of intervention.
Perceived
choice,
need.
a perceived need,
yeah.
perceived need. A choice to use the schools, which is another matter, to be a lever on that change.
Yeah.
And yet the use by those who intended to shape it in different ways.
They have different ideas, right?
Different ideas than the reformers.
They don't really care what the reformers
There we
think.
go.
They're like, okay, we're gonna use the school for these other purposes.
Gotcha. Now, another instance you mentioned as well had to do with the South before.
Yeah. So we can think of this as another case, right, with the sort of the unintended consequences of reform. But in the South, in the post-World War II period, there's a series of court cases. This is pretty well known now. The NAACP is undertaking these challenges to segregation, particularly at the higher education level at first. And they're successful in University of Texas, University of Oklahoma. And the argument is that separate but equal is not equal, right? So you can't have a separate law school be the equivalent of the University of Texas Law School. So you have to integrate it. So the southern states can see where this is going in terms of the school system. And of course, historically, the southern school systems were not just segregated, but they were incredibly unequal. I mean, African American schools were funded at a tiny fraction of the level of the white schools, through most of the 20th century. Now that was gradually changing, but around 1948, the southern states began this series of moves. It was under the rubric of equalization. Now, equalization is a term that had been used for, there was an earlier battle over teacher salaries and so on, but it came to assume this sort of wider meaning, which was to kind of level up, to spend more money on African American education to make it at least appear to be more equivalent to white schools, because they were afraid that they were very vulnerable to this charge of unequal treatment, which was the Plessy decision back in the 1890s had maintained that segregation was okay as long as you had equality, right? The 14th Amendment said that you cannot have inequality due to unequal treatment due to race, right? So equal treatment had to be there. So the equalization campaigns was an effort to try and make this at least appear to be equal. And one big piece of that, one major piece of that, was building high schools for African Americans. In 1940, if you look at African American 19-year-olds using census data, the number of those with a high school diploma was about 13%. And for white 19-year-olds, it was almost 50%. So the African American rate of high school graduation was less than a third that of the whites in 1940. And that was largely due, and incidentally, of those high school graduates, the black and white high school graduates, they had equal likelihood of going to college. So the big barrier for African American students at that time was the lack of access to high schools. There were very few high schools in the South. They tended to be in the big cities. Most African American kids lived in the countryside in 1940. So the southern states, with equalization, one of the big features was building high schools for African Americans, so that all of these counties, South Carolina and Georgia, particularly across the lower South, and Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, the big focus was making sure that African American kids, there was a high school available. Massive building campaign. The other thing was school consolidation. Most of the black schools that existed in the South at this time were one-room schools or two-room schools, one or two teacher schoolhouses. Really incredibly poor condition. So they were building bigger and just wooden buildings, just dilapidated wooden buildings with many of them, no running water. So building brick buildings that had multiple classrooms, and you could have more curricular variety and more teachers. So this was the big push in the later 40s and early 50s. And with those new systems, having the kids be able to go all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. So this begins to happen as a consequence that gap in high school graduation closes very rapidly. And by 1960 is the point that where you reach a majority of African American teenagers are in high school. That's kind of a really big point. And they're graduating in numbers kind of close to that. So close to that sort of 50% mark. So it's really a remarkable change in a relatively short period of time historically. Now the southern states, they're very pleased with this because they're saying that, okay, we've really, and the between 1948 and 1952, there are several southern states that actually spend more money on black schooling than on whites at that time. Now some places like Georgia, they're actually spending money on all schools, and this is how they sell it to the white voters, right? This is a school enhancement plan that's going to be for everybody. But when they do that, they're trying to spend more money on African American schools. Now, this doesn't, the money goes from the state, these extra monies, because most schooling is locally funded, but this is a new thing in the South at that time. Those extra state monies come in, and a lot of the local school boards take some of that money and use it on the white schools when it should have been for the black schools. So that I don't want to make it seem like the black schools that are being built are equal to the white schools. In some cases they were, in most cases they were not. But in any case, the consequence is you have suddenly, in historical terms, pretty brief period of time, you have large numbers of high school graduates who start going to college. So that, and in the South that means segregated colleges. So they're going to North Carolina A&T, or they're going to Tuskegee, or they're going to, the state, largely the state institutions are growing more rapidly at this time. And now, the other thing, of course, that's going on at the same time is the civil rights movement is gaining steam. And one of the huge events in the history of the civil rights movement is the lunch counter sit-ins, which began in North Carolina, and it's college students, African American college students. And this was sort of a spontaneous thing, right? That going into what was supposed to be a segregated lunch counter and just sitting down and saying, "Look, serve us," right? And of course the authorities don't want to make a big scene, so. And when this happens, it gets in the newspapers, and it just spreads across the South. And the group that is spearheading this are the African American college and high school students, which suddenly there's large numbers of them, which wasn't the case 20 years earlier. And then later on, there's the Freedom Riders, you know, getting on buses and going into the segregated bus stations, and you know, going into the segregated bathrooms and the lunch counters again, and then there's big confrontations with the police, and this is getting national attention, is sort of mobilizing opinion against the system of segregation. And the shock troops, the front line of this are those African American students. You know, when Martin Luther King goes to Birmingham in 1963, and those you know, Bull Connor's got his police dogs and the fire hoses, and those are students. Those are high school students and college students who are who are taking that abuse and getting attention internationally, shining the spotlight on the vicious character of segregation in the South. Now, when the Southern states in 1948 and 49 and 50 decided to start pouring money into African American, did they anticipate that this was going to have the result of creating a generation of activists?
I'm guessing
That's what happened. That's what happened. So,
yeah.
Unintended consequence. And again, it's what the schools get used for, right? Because when they built those schools, the schools weren't staffed by white teachers; they were staffed by black teachers, right? And the other thing was, going to high school at that time. You know, high school education had been denied to African Americans for so long that the idea that education was something that African Americans A, didn't need, or B, couldn't handle, right? Or they lacked whatever, you know, the intellectual grounding or capacity or capability for that. So going to high school and graduating and going to college was a refutation of that, of those ideas. So this was part of the movement, right? And there being, you know, in those institutions, there's this idea of freedom and equality, right? Is what they're striving for. So those institutions that were built with this money, you know, were part of an ethos of resistance that you know, it's not surprising that those kids were responding in such large numbers to the development of the civil rights movement. So it's the uses that the institution is put to by the people, right?
Yeah.
That are coming to it, right? That and in many cases that are new to it, right? The institution has a logic. It was created for certain purposes, but people come to it and they have different uses for it.
It reminds me of Morell's work on some of the cities in the north, looking at Eastern immigrants coming in and the various Americanization programs, right? And I thought that was it was funny to see. I mean, how to Americanize, teach language, and teach them the rights of the American democracy, and one of which they thought was great. This is a free press, so now we can go out and found Polish American local newspapers to advertise the glories of being Polish.
Right. Right.
So they asserted their ethnic identity after having been prepared to do that.
That's a good example. Yes, indeed.
So maybe shift a little bit, but some of the other work you've looked at in particular, and I was still working on, has to do with looking at the geography of inequalities, the changes taking place, particularly across suburban and urban lines. And I'm just wondering if you might.
Well, there's the big shift.
How does that help us understand what's going on in schools?
Yeah, and Jeff has written about this in his work on Detroit, along with many other historians. And so this is the big change. I mean, it's from that same period we were just talking about, the 1960s, and this occurred in the South and the North. But we're probably most familiar with it in the North. And it's called white flight, right? African Americans leave the countryside cotton production gets mechanized and other things happen, and they have, you know, job opportunities with industrial growth in the north and elsewhere, beginning in World War II, but afterwards also. And so you have this massive movement of African Americans out of the countryside into the cities. Now, at the same time, and the two aren't as linked causally as many people suspect, but at the same time, and in post-World War II period, you have the veterans coming back from the war, and the economy is you know, there was depression before the war, but afterwards the economy is kind of growing to everybody's surprise. Some people, many people thought we would go back to depression, and they were afraid of that. But the economy was growing at a pretty rapid clip, and so people were getting jobs, and these veterans, they started having kids right almost immediately upon arrival. The baby boom begins almost immediately, and so
long war. So,
yeah, pent up demand, right?
Yes,
so,
yes.
and they're bringing the war brides, you know, all that stuff. So anyway, they're looking for homes, you know, and the cities are crowded. The housing stock is old, you know. There's less room, and so and this is the automobile is this very convenient form of transportation, and the developers, the housing, the real estate industry, they're building homes on the outskirts of the city and the suburbs, and this had already began. Obviously, suburbs weren't invented with this period, post-war period, but they expand very rapidly. And new advances in housing construction, sort of the mass production of homes, prefabrication, you know, that lowers costs, and massive subdivision development and planned communities, Levittown, New York, Levittown, New Jersey, right? So this model begins to spread, and shopping centers, you know, and prior to World War II, you could count the shopping centers in the United States on one hand, you know, and by 1960 there's like thousands of them. So this automobile culture, and then of course the Eisenhower administration starts building the interstate system, you know, which makes this whole thing possible. So suburbanization kicks in, and you get this. Now it's often framed. This is interesting. It's often framed as a movement out of the city, and it is that to some extent. But suburbanization is also people deciding, you know, as they move to a city, they can move to the city itself or to the suburbs, right? So it's people moving into the suburbs from someplace else. They're not moving out from the central city. They're moving from some small town or from some rural area, and they decide to move to the city because of opportunities there. But they look, where are we going to move to? Let's move to the suburbs, right? So suburban growth is occurring because of people's because of the types of housing, the new housing, the affordability piece, the allure, which grows with time. People choose the suburbs over the cities when they relocate, and that actually accounts for a certain type of suburb, right? Not the white flight suburb, or the people leaving the city because the big city because it's whatever is repelling them there, particularly race. But it's people who are coming from someplace else, and they're deciding, okay, we choose the suburb. You know, so, and of course the cities, the African Americans are moving into the city, and that's where you're beginning to get the racial tension, conflict, that contributes to what eventually is called white flight. But so it's a complicated mix of things that leads to this, contributes to this process of suburbanization. Now the other dimension of this is people are choosing places to live. They evaluate these places in a number of terms. So there are certain groups of people, particularly college-educated people. Now the other thing that's going on, of course, is the GI Bill, right? So GIs are coming back from the war, and there's this move to provide them certain benefits. And one of the things that's sort of thrown in the mix is the idea of college education, and the sponsors of this legislation didn't think that this would be a big issue with somebody, so I'll just put it in there. And turns out it was very popular. So you have millions of GIs who go to college, and even if they didn't finish, they gained skills that could then enable them to get white collar jobs, live in the suburbs. So what we find is that education becomes this dimension of people clustering, right? Or you find that certain communities, particularly in the suburbs, will have this characteristic of more college-educated adults. And these tend to be slightly more what we call upscale or fashionable areas that become known for their schools, the quality of the public schools. And I was mentioning earlier that 1957, Newsweek and Time Magazine published this article about the first sort of survey of school qualities based on the number of national merit and scholarship finalists that each high school produces. And, so there's this sort of and most of them, some of them are city high schools, but many of them are suburban high schools. And, so it marks sort of a point where suddenly the public is, and this is picked up in the local newspapers, and in Kansas City, which I've studied, it becomes a big deal. That suddenly, you know, certain districts stand out as these lighthouses of quality. And it turns out that those are the districts with large numbers of highly educated parents. And later on, the sociologists, Coleman in particular, you know, point out that the primary determinant of student success on achievement tests like the National Merit Scholarship Test was the parental background, right? So that's what's. So this clustering is beginning to give the suburban schools a reputation for excellence. That and of course then the African Americans are going into the inner city schools, and as you get more African Americans and they're coming from the South, they're poorer, they have less education. So and as they come to schools, particularly high schools, whites leave. And so there's this period of racial transition in many inner city areas. Now, those schools then suddenly are perceived to be of lower quality because the graduation rate goes down a little bit. And whites and the white press, and even in the African American press, there's this sort of idea that the quality of urban education is declining, and it's linked to race. On the other hand, for African American students coming from the South, those schools are as good or better than the high schools that they came from, and their graduation rates are going up. African American and attainment is still converging with whites until about 1980, at which point the black rate of graduation is about 80% of the white rate. So it goes from less than a third to about 80%. And if you control, we do a statistical analysis regression where you control for the poverty level and family structure and other factors, city versus suburb, you know, all those kind of things. The racial difference, purely racial, will disappear. And actually, blacks will be more likely to graduate if you control for those factors.
Can you say that again? That sounds.
If you control for poverty, and control for geography, and control for family structure, you know, single parent versus. So if you have African Americans who go to who live in suburban neighborhoods, who have two parents who are not in poverty, are actually more likely in 1980 to graduate from high school than white kids. And the other big factor, of course, as I mentioned, was parental education. So if you have an African American family with at least one college-educated parent and all those other attributes, they are more likely to graduate from high school than a white student with similar characteristics. So that's what I mean by the racial distinction will disappear statistically in that sense by 1980. In 1960, that's not the case because of the, you know, it took African Americans a while to catch up.
Interesting. So how does this affect then how we think about what are the great hallmarks of U.S. education has been local control?
Yeah.
And yet obviously these are, we're talking about shifts and migrations and so forth that affect who's in which localities and also the numbers and types of these localities. How do you see, how would you explain local control?
Well, it's the conundrum of the desegregation movement, you know, and it was a recognition, and this revolved around a recognition in the 1960s and 70s that geographic separation or geographic segregation was one of the underlying causes of school segregation in many big urban districts in particular. So this is where the practice of busing came into play, right? So to try to overcome. Now, the 1974 Milken v. Bradley decision in Detroit kind of stops that at the city line, right? Where in that case, the NAACP and other plaintiffs argued that the suburbs outside of Detroit needed to be included in the desegregation plan because so many whites had left the city of Detroit that it wasn't really possible to have integrated schools throughout the city, right, as a consequence. And the Supreme Court ruled on a 5-4 decision that because the suburban districts had not actively promoted the segregation of schools within the city of Detroit, they couldn't be held liable and therefore be included in the plan. And so that ruling had a very chilling effect on subsequent desegregation decisions. So, or plans that kind of restricted them to the cities and left the suburbs without having to concern themselves with desegregation. So the busing actually, I mean, there's a lot of evidence. My colleague Argan Sanchez-Santiago has a really terrific book coming out on Cleveland that demonstrates that desegregation within the city was enormously effective. That it really improved the school experience in attainment and achievement for African American students and had little to no negative effect for whites. And it was a very carefully, thoughtfully planned and conducted desegregation plan, wherein students were virtually randomly distributed, which really makes his job of analysis a lot easier and more powerful. So, and there's lots of other studies that the effect of desegregated schools was basically a pretty remarkable increase in African American achievement. And if you look at the at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, which begins in 1971. Between 1971 and 1988, and this is the period, right, when desegregation is sort of reaching its climax. And so the kids who are in school then are taking the NAEP test from the 70s to the 80s, right? The achievement gap as measured by NAEP, which is, like I said, the gold standard of assessment, it closes by 50% in less than a 20-year period. I mean, it's really, so we talked about the achievement gap today. Well, here's a period. Well, we've talked about two things. Number one, the attainment gap, the graduation gap, dramatic closing, right? And because of equalization and desegregation. And then the achievement gap, dramatic closing because of desegregation. I mean, not entirely. It's complicated. And a lot of it has to do with the improved education of black parents, right? But another piece of it is the desegregation. And of course, desegregation stops, like I said, slows down a lot, and then after that we see that the gap ceases to close. So there is this broad historical set of developments that kind of point to some very interesting relationships.
You've been very generous with your time, but if I can squeeze in one more question.
Okay.
Given all of that, how would you locate the current sort of reform agenda that particularly has an emphasis around standards, as reflected in Common Core, in an accountability scheme, and in trying to increase choice options, at least in some areas? How does that fit this?
Okay, okay, so you're asking a historian to talk about current events. Okay,
exactly,
all right.
Exactly.
So I'll go on a limb here. This is, I'm like a fish on dry land, okay? So,
we'll put you back in the water shortly,
okay.
but just flip for a little bit.
All right, so I will say something, I'll try to be dramatic, okay? So I'll say we have two systems in the United States today, at least, probably more than that. But these are broad generalizations. But we have, and oftentimes people will say the American education is in crisis and we're falling behind the rest of the world, and we have all these problems in the schools and so on. But I would say in the suburban communities, and again this is a big generalization, they're not all the same, but as a tendency, suburban schools in the United States by and large are doing fine. They are doing well, many of them. There was that famous, at least locally in Chicago, case in the 1980s or 90s, mid-90s. It's in my book. This is why we have books, by the way. It's our hard memory. But when there was a consortium of schools in the North Shore of Chicago, right, the northern suburbs of Chicago, persuaded the TIMS people, the International Math Science, to give the test to their high school students.
Right.
And they scored second in the world.
Right.
So affluent high school students, they are doing fine. Just to the south of them, in the city of Chicago, very different story. So this is what we have today. And this, in Kansas City, where I live, that area, there's the Johnson County schools, Shawnee Mission, Blue Valley, Olathe. These are world-class schools, and just across the city line, it's a different world. Either way, to Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri. Poor performing schools. In Missouri, they lost their accreditation. They just provisionally regained it, but they're still struggling. And it's not. People say, well, there's good schools and bad schools, but it's the family backgrounds of the students are the primary drivers. It's the high poverty in Kansas City and the affluence and highly educated parents in Johnson County. At Blue Valley School District, one of their administrators told me 75% of the kids have college-educated parents. That's in a country where about 25% of the population has college degrees. So this is a triple that district. So it's not surprising that it's high. Whereas in Kansas City, the number is probably about 10 or 12%. So it's just an enormous difference. So that's why I say we have two systems, right? We have the suburban system, and there are not charter schools being built in these districts. Nobody in Blue Valley or Shawnee Mission or Lee Summit or even Raytown, which is a integrated suburb now, or North Kansas City, they're not asking for charter schools. Nobody's saying we need charters. We go to Kansas City, Missouri. The district there, the actual public school district, is under 20,000 now. The other, a bigger group of the students are in charters or private schools that have been, the charters are now sponsored by all kinds of groups. But so that's where this focal point of these reform measures is on that aspect. And this is what you see around the country. You don't see the charter schools, the call for vouchers. The suburbanites, they don't want vouchers. They want those schools to remain, at least perceived as very good, because their housing values are tied to that. Right? So they don't want anybody tinkering with their schools. Right? There's no utopia. They've arrived, right? There's no tinkering towards utopia, right?
Right.
So they're like, don't tinker.
In Utopia Hills.
Right, exactly. Don't tinker with our schools. Go tinker in the city, right?
Yeah.
You know, so that's my observation, is that the geography now means that we have separate systems. So to speak.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Appreciate it.